Now, if you're going to understand the Microsoft services and work with their products, especially all their cutting edge stuff, it's important for you to have a good foundation of the way things were, the way things are now, and kind of what Microsoft's vision is for the future. And so I want to make sure you have a good solid foundation of things like Active Directory, domains, remote access, virtualization, and then of course getting into the cloud stuff and how kind of things sort of came together. Okay, so we'll start with this. You go back far enough, you go back to the 1950s, the 1960s. They had mainframes, these massive computers that would take up the size of a room, and then eventually they became sort of the size of a refrigerator. And then as we got to the 1970s, people started making their own computers, and we got to the late 70s and the concept of personal computing came out. And then by the time we got to the 80s, you actually started seeing computers in businesses. And so your companies out there would have actual computers that your office staff could use. And I'm just going to kind of draw a couple things out for you here. And the idea here with these computers is they would start populating the office, and maybe you'd have, let's say you've got 1,000 computers in your business. And of course, in the early days of computers, like as we got into the 1980s, when PCs and stuff started really becoming popular, we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. Okay, peer-to-peer network basically means that every computer is equal. There is no real authority over each individual computer. In other words, if your boss walks up to you and says, "Hey, IT person, I want you to configure 5 things on all 1,000 computers," you had to either A, sit down at all 1,000 computers and configure them one at a time, or B, you had to write a script to do it. So peer-to-peer networking is not a great way to try to achieve things centrally, right? So what happened was a company called Novell, they created a product called NetWare. They really changed things. They really pushed this whole concept of what is called client servers, where you have a more powerful computer, maybe not the size of a mainframe, but a more powerful computer, and your client computers interact with that server, right? Well, then, of course, Microsoft eventually got into the networking world as well. They created this thing called a domain, which was very similar to what Novell was doing. And then you reach the year 2000, where things really sort of change. Microsoft comes out with a new type of domain. They start using a triangle as their symbol of a domain. All right. And one of the main concepts of a domain is that you have a special type of server, okay? And the server is called a domain controller, all right? So we'll just put DC, all right? And inside that domain controller, you have a database. I'm just going to draw this little cylinder looking thing for you guys here, all right? And this is your database. Now, your database is called the Active Directory database, all right? And so your domain controller is what controls your domain. So if you really want to know, like, why are domains important, all right, my answer to you is one word, and that is centralization. A lot of people think security. Yeah, security is important, definitely, but centralization is why domains are so important, okay? Because they allow us to control all of our stuff, our clients, our servers, all of that stuff centrally, right? We can manage it all in one place instead of having to sit down at each individual machine and make changes, right? That's the idea, okay? Now, of course, you're going to want to have usually more than one domain controller, and the reason why you don't want to have more than one domain controller is the same reason you want to have more than one of anything, really, more than one of any server especially, and that is fault tolerance and load balancing. Okay, fault tolerance meaning redundancy. If one fails, you've got another, okay, and load balancing, you don't want all of your machines having to interact with only one server. I always use the analogy, it's like going to the grocery store and getting a cartload of groceries and, going to check out, and then you get to the checkout line, it turns out there's only one cash register, one cashier open, and there's like 15 people waiting in line to check out, right? Well, first off, if that cash register breaks down, that's the only one they've got, well, nobody's going to get to check out, right? Secondly, you got a performance problem, right? It's going to take forever to get out of that store. So what you want to see is a bunch of cash registers open, right? When you go to check out at a grocery store, and That way you can kind of load balance, right? Some people can go to one line, some people can go to another, so on and so forth. So we can do that if we've got multiple servers, okay? So these domain controllers also have these things called GPOs, group policy objects, which help us control everything. So instead of having to sit down and one at a time and make changes to a machine, I can create this thing called a GPO. The GPO can deploy the settings out to the machines. Okay, now something else that's interesting about Active Directory. Active Directory being the directory services database and all that you use. It uses a protocol called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which is basically like the language that your directory services speak. User accounts, groups, all that stuff. Passwords are all kept in there. And it also uses a protocol called Kerberos for its security. Now, domain controllers replicate. So whatever you do to one Active Directory database, it actually does it to the other. For example, if I create a little user account, we'll say that this little smiley face guy that I'm making here, he is going to represent a user account. All right. If we make this user account, we create the user account on the first domain controller here. That's actually going to replicate to the other domain controller and any of the other domain controllers that are in the Active Directory domain. So what I'm basically saying here is that these domain controllers replicate with each other. So when you change one database, it's going to replicate over to the other. So they stay in sync. Okay. Now another important component of a Microsoft domain is your domain must have a name. Okay. And the name that it uses is a DNS name, domain name system, also known as domain name space, also known as domain name service. Okay. And this is because we human beings don't really like to identify devices by numbers. We don't really like having to memorize lots of numbers, right? We prefer to use names when we identify things. So DNS is the service that does that, okay? All your computers and services and all that, they have IP addresses that they use, which are numbers, but we like to associate things with words and names. So your domain will have a name. Like, for example, if my domain is called examlabpractice.com, that's my company name. A lot of times your domain name will be the same as your web presence. Okay. So the other problem with that though is if you're gonna, if your domain's gonna have a DNS name, you've got to have a DNS service that's gonna manage all that. So we actually have to have a server called a DNS server. Now, granted, your domain controller can actually play this role, but I'm gonna draw it separately here. And inside that DNS database, inside that DNS server, we have what is called a DNS database. So I'm going to draw another one of these little cylinder looking things here. And the other thing that's interesting about that is that the database will be named after your domain. So if your domain's name is examlabpractice.com, your database is going to be called examlabpractice.com. That database is called a zone database, also known as a name database or namespace database. And what will happen is all of your computers, as they come online, they will automatically register their names inside that database, their names and their IP addresses. So now when the computers want to find each other, they can actually query that DNS server to find each other. So when these computers boot up, they have to authenticate to one of these domain controllers using Kerberos. They're going to do LDAP-based queries to do that. But they're going to first actually query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know who my domain controller is? And since those domain controllers have actually registered DNS, he'll reply back, and then the client can go and get authenticated. Okay, and you are officially authenticated. And then when a client wants to communicate with the file server, they'll actually query for the file server through DNS as well. Okay. So that is your basic back and forth that is happening to make all of this work. Now, we also have an internet connection to think about. So let's draw this little cloud symbol here, and we'll just kind of clean it up here. There we go. So our little cloud here is going to represent the internet coming in. All right. And let me just label that internet. Of course, you don't want your internal network to be, completely unprotected. So you probably want to have a firewall, right? Firewall router type combination. So we'll say FW for firewall. We'll put a little box around it. That's going to be our firewall, and that's going to help police traffic going out to the internet and things coming in from the internet. All right, and we'll talk more about things coming in here in a minute in the next foundation video. But hopefully this gives you now a good understanding of just the basics of what is a domain, why is it important, its centralization purposes. You can deploy GPOs, group policy objects, which throw restrictions out there on people's machines and all that. And hopefully that gives you a nice little solid foundation of just what a domain and Active Directory is. I now like to talk to you about the remote access side of things. I want to talk a little bit about what a DMZ and all that stuff is as well. So as we move on here, I mentioned Active Directory. It came out in the year 2000. Originally it was called, it was an operating system called NT5, and then Windows 2000 is when they released it with, and they changed the name. They changed the name from NT5 to Windows 2000, and the directory service used to be called NTDS, and they renamed it to Active Directory. Okay, so 20 years ago, Active Directory came out. This was cutting edge. It was great. It was awesome. And one of the things that we sometimes need to happen is we need computers on the outside world to get to the inside world, right? So imagine you've got a computer here, maybe you got somebody working from home and they need to be able to access a resource, like maybe they need to access that file server. Well, let me tell you what you don't want to do. You don't want to just open up a bunch of ports on your firewall and let things in. Like file servers in Windows use a protocol called SMB, Server Message Block, and that uses a port 445, and there's a few other ports here too, but you would be opening ports coming in to let things come in from the internet, and that's very dangerous, right? We don't want to do that on our firewall. We don't want to open up file ports and all that because we're just asking for a bad guy, all right? We're asking for a hacker to attempt to get into our environment, right? So let me just make a hacker here. All right, let's just zoom in on him. We're going to make him a bad guy here. Let's give him some devil horns. Let's give him a devil tail. All right, we'll make him look like he's just in a bad mood. All right, okay. All right, sometimes I get a little carried away. Sorry. All right, so there's my hacker. All right, and we don't want to open up a bunch of ports because we don't want a hacker to be able to get in, right? That's essentially where we're going with this. Now, we do have somebody over here though that we do want to get in, so maybe we're going to let them do that. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One would be to get something called a VPN concentrator or VPN router. It's basically an appliance, a box that you put on your network and you let people securely get in. Now, the Microsoft way, sort of their solution usually, is to set up a server called a RAS server, sometimes referred to as an RAS server, okay? And that RAS server is a remote access server, and from what we can do there is we can allow access with our firewall. We can allow what's known as a VPN, a virtual private network. So from there, you can securely connect from this outside world to that RAS server, and you can access this file server or some other resources, and it's all going to be encrypted using what's called an encrypted tunnel, okay? And that's going to be one of your main ways and one of your safest ways to allow things to come in. Okay, another thing Microsoft supports is a thing called direct access, which are not really focusing a lot on that these days, but VPN is going to be one of the main ways that you do this. Okay, there are other solutions. You can set up this thing called a remote desktop gateway and allow remote desktop in, but VPN is going to be your main core way to do things. Okay, now the other thing I'd like to mention is, what about situations where we have something like a server that we need to make available to the outside world, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are hosting your own web server, all right? You have a web server and you are hosting it. You're not going to pay GoDaddy or somebody like that to do it. You're going to host your own web server. Well, here's the question. Where are you going to host it? Are you going to host it in here? Are you going to host it out here? Well, I'm going to tell you, if you host it in here, that's dangerous, because if you're letting people get to your web server anonymously, then you got people coming in here and going through your firewall and accessing that web server. Well, hackers can do this thing called pivoting. If they gain control over that server, they might be able to pivot to other resources. So that would not be a good idea. A better solution would be to store the web server out here. Okay. The problem, though, with storing it outside your firewall like that is you are not really giving your web server any protection. It's exposed completely to the elements at that point. It's outside the firewall. So generally, the rule of thumb, what most people would do with this is they would actually get another firewall. Okay. And they'd put the other firewall actually next to their internet. And at that point, you have something called a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, also known as a perimeter network. So there are a couple of names for that DMZ perimeter network. And the great thing about that is I can police now the traffic flowing in through the firewall. I can police that. I might allow, like, for example, port 80, 443. You might have a DNS, and if you do, you do port 53. But now people can get to this web server coming in, but then you could block everything except maybe your VPN and all that going through that firewall. So that is the idea of a DMZ. So if a hacker was to gain control over that web server, they would still be blocked and would not be able to flow through that firewall. That's the logic, okay, of this. All right. So now, so the concept here is there's multiple solutions when it comes to trying to allow people out, allow people in. If you're wanting to host something like a web server, maybe you want to do the same thing with an email server. Microsoft has Exchange, and you have a type of Exchange role called Edge, which of course we could have what's called an Exchange Edge server in there. And really, the mentality there is the logic has always been with the world that, at least in IT, we've always kind of felt as IT people we needed to sort of host everything ourselves and manage everything ourselves. And I want to kind of go over a couple of things in that regard. Let me just kind of move some of this out of the way to make some room here. All right. So first off, I talked about centralization in a domain and the fact that we have to have central control. GPOs are going to be one of our main ways to do that. Microsoft also has another server that helps you get even more control over your environment. And in the 90s, they called it SMS, System Management Services. And then in the early 2000s, they renamed this server that I'm about to tell you about to SCCM, which is System Center Configuration Manager. Okay. And so for the longest time, that's what it is. That's what it was called. And System Center Configuration Manager can even more so control your devices. It can inventory devices. You can deploy images. You can deploy applications. You can configure compliance. I mean, there's a ton of stuff you can do with SCCM. All right. And more recently, that got renamed to another product. It is no longer called SCCM. Hopefully this is not a shocker to you. It is now called Endpoint Config Manager. I'm just going to put CM, Endpoint Configuration Manager. All right. And this is because of a product that they're deploying in the cloud called Intune that has sort of become the big cloud-based system for managing things. And what they want is they want Config Manager and this other product, Intune, to sort of centrally work together. And so they renamed Config Manager to Endpoint Configuration Manager. And so that's what it is now referred to as. All right. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is that another sort of logic that we've had over the years when it comes to managing things as IT people is that, we got to have all these different servers, right? Like we have to have an Exchange server. All right. We got to have a SharePoint server. I'll just say SPT. We got to have a database server like SQL, SQL, and we've already got a file server, right? Let me use that little file server here. Actually, I'll just for the sake of keeping the font sizes the same, we'll just make it a little bit smaller so it'll fit here. So we got a file server. Now, the mentality has always been that we have to host all these servers ourselves, okay? And we have to have all this equipment in order to do it. And so you end up with a lot of servers in order to deal with everything. Okay, so in the early 2000s, a company called VMware really came to the table with some innovative solutions for dealing with the problem of having so many servers, so much hardware. And they came up with, they actually used an old solution to fix newer problems. There's a thing called hypervisors. This was a term that actually came out in the 1970s, back in the Unix days, early Unix days, and it was a virtualization idea. Hypervisor is not a new thing. It's actually been around for a long time. Okay, so they actually really came up with some cutting edge stuff on this, and the concept was that, if you can emulate hardware, processors and RAM and storage and network, you can then put software on that emulated hardware. So the idea of a virtual machine, is a emulated hardware, and you've got software installed on that, like server, Windows 10, Windows Server, all that. So you could take these 4 servers, these 4 physical servers, and you could actually run them on a single physical server, okay? So instead of having so many different, pieces of hardware here that you're trying to deal with and manage, you could do it all on a physical server. Of course, a lot of people, when they see that, they're like, now you've got a single point of failure. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So VMware really took off. Microsoft definitely took note of what they did. Microsoft actually bought a product called Virtual PC and then turned it into Virtual Server, and then eventually they renamed it to Hyper-V. So that is actually the Microsoft virtualization solution, even though VMware is still probably considered more popular than Hyper-V. So the other thing that we've got here is the fact that we have a single point of failure, I mentioned. If that server dies, we're in trouble, right? Well, see, that's the beauty of virtualization. We have the ability of actually very easily getting another server. All right, let me shrink this down a little bit. We can get another server. We can use a storage area network. We can host our virtual machines on that. And the Hyper-V servers can do clustering. So you can get a very high level of redundancy with the help of virtualization, okay? And so that's the idea of virtualization. Now, with virtualization came another term, and it's the term elasticity. Elasticity means that those servers can have tons of memory, tons of storage, tons of network bandwidth, tons of CPU usage, and they can pool it. So if the Exchange virtual machine needs more memory and the SQL virtual machine doesn't, then SQL can give up the memory it's not using, and the Exchange virtual machine can use that memory and CPU usage. And so, and it can shrink and grow and shrink and grow. Okay, and that's one of the greatest benefits of virtual machines. Another great benefit of virtual machines is the fact that you have these things called checkpoints, which used to be called snapshots. Okay, but they're now called checkpoints. At least in Hyper-V terms they are. So this really changed things, and as you'll see, this is also sort of the forerunner of cloud computing. All right. Okay, but hopefully that gives you guys now a decent foundation of some of the other concepts, remote access, DMZ, as well as the basics idea of virtualization. Okay, so it's now time to talk about sort of how cloud computing came about, all right? So with virtualization and this concept of elasticity, it definitely got people thinking. And that was, you know what? We could actually, as a company, host hardware and make that hardware available to people to host resources like virtual machines on our hardware. Now, this isn't a new idea. Let me give you an example. Okay, between my wife and myself, and I have 3 teenage daughters, and I know no stress in my life whatsoever, right? But 2 of them are driving. They have cars. So I have 4 cars that we have to deal with. Okay, now I like to use the analogy of this. Now, when it comes to if one of those cars breaks down, I have a couple of options. One is I could fix the car myself. So I could actually turn my garage into an auto mechanic shop. I could buy all the tools, get all the skills, learn how to work on cars, and do it myself. Buy a hydraulic lift and, really go at it. And that could cost a lot of money up front to get all of that and get the skills and all of that, right? And I also have to maintain that garage. I have to maintain the tools and make sure it's clean and make sure everything's organized so that I can do a good job, and everything, have electricity and all of that's needed, right? And then I could work on the cars myself. Now that mentality, that sort of do-it-yourself mentality, is the way that we've always done things in IT. We've hosted our own equipment. We've set up our own data centers. We've provided power and air conditioning. We had to have skills to manage the hardware that went with it all, right? So there's a lot that went into that. And that was always the mentality. Now, the other mentality is, if my cars break down, I can take it to a company that offers that as a service. Okay, like there's auto mechanic shops, they got the garage, they got the tools, they got the people that have the skills. They can work on the car for me and fix it for a fee. And that is a concept. That's basically what sort of like you have with cloud computing. Now there's different phases of it, but ultimately that's the logic, okay? So companies like Microsoft and Amazon, they have gone out and they have set up these huge warehouses, huge data centers full of equipment. Okay, you're talking tons of server blades, CPUs, tons of CPUs, RAM, storage, network bandwidth, and they are offering that as a service. Okay, so let's draw this big cloud here. All right, this is going to be, we'll say Microsoft's cloud. All right, let me make it a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay. So they have made their own, they've got their own equipment, their own data centers, and they're basically going to host equipment for us to use as customers. That's the idea. All right, these data centers are connected to the internet. All right, there are different versions. There's actually government equipment and equipment for consumer use. There's also the education system can get access to it. There's a lot of different pieces to all of this, right? Okay, so I want to introduce you to a couple of acronyms. All right, the first acronym is IaaS. IaaS is Infrastructure as a Service. Okay, Infrastructure as a Service is the concept of hosting all the equipment and making that equipment available to consumers. Okay, so for example, they will host all the equipment for you. They will maintain it. They will provide power, air conditioner, redundancy. They'll keep the equipment updated. And we can host things on their equipment. So you see these virtual machines over here? I can host those in their cloud. So I can host virtual machines. Okay? They will also provide other resources, virtual appliances. So you're getting into things like virtual load balancers. You're talking about virtual firewalls. Okay, they've got virtual storage for backing things up. Okay, they'll host databases out there for you as a service. There's a lot of things they're going to host out there for you. And the great thing about this is you just pay for what you use. So if you don't use very much, you're not going to pay very much. You know, I do consulting work. I have one client that basically they have a virtual server running Server 2019 and they pay $30 a month, and they have a few people that hit it every day. You know, it's not that expensive. Of course, you can get into the higher tiers. Now, the other great thing about it is it's elastic. So if you got a lot of things going on that server, then Microsoft can give you more CPU, more memory, more storage, more network. Of course, you're going to pay for that, right? Now, their cloud is called, their IaaS cloud is called Azure. Okay, by the way, that's how I pronounce that. You may pronounce it different. Azure, Azure, I've heard it pronounced Azure. There's so many different names for it. I actually tried one time to figure out the proper way to say that word. I actually watched the videos of the guys who created Azure. And guess what? They don't say it the same way either. they call it something different too. So that's how I say that word, okay? Azure. So Azure is their platform for dealing with all of these virtual, the hardware basically that you can store virtual things on, like VMs and appliances, and it's all you're basically paying for what you use, how much CPU you use, memory, storage, network, all that. Now there's another piece to this, okay, and it's called PaaS. And there's SaaS. Some people pronounce it PaaS and SaaS. Now, PaaS is Platform as a Service. Platform as a Service is where they are hosting some kind of a web-based platform, and you have to configure it and set it up the way you want, and deploy it the way you want, configure it the way you want for your people. All right, and then essentially they're giving you a platform with the tools to do what you need, but you have to use those tools. And then SaaS, which is software as a service, is basically apps that are being hosted, applications like, for example, you can access Word online and Excel online and PowerPoint online and all that. Now, their PaaS and SaaS platform is actually called Microsoft 365. Okay. They used to call it Office 365, but it confused everybody because everybody thinks of like Office, right? You know, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all that. But they changed it to Microsoft 365, and what you'll find is that Office 365 is part of that. And that's Office 365 is considered believe it or not, a platform as a service, because you completely configure it and you can deploy the apps out, and you can have Office online, Office on the web. Okay, that is your software as a service, okay, side of things. Okay, now another piece of this that you get is you get things like Exchange Online. Okay, so they're going to host the email stuff out there for you. They're going to host SharePoint online. All right. You have something called OneDrive for Business. That is their storage. And then you have Teams. Okay, so they were doing Skype for Business, and Skype for Business going away. They have Teams, right? Teams is wonderful. It's a great collaboration tool and all of that. Okay, that you use, and so you have that, and then you've also got a product called Intune. Intune is Microsoft's MDM MAM product. So mobile device management, mobile application management. This is their product when it comes to managing all of your devices. The great thing about Intune, you can manage on-premise devices like this. You can manage cloud devices or internet devices that are just connected to the internet, like smartphones, tablets, things like that. Even devices that are at people's homes, if they allow you to, you can actually manage those too. Intune is now also part of the Endpoint Manager configuration. So you're going to use a tool called Endpoint Manager to manage Intune, and it is related to Endpoint Configuration Manager. So the thing is that it confused everybody when Intune came out, because it could do a lot of the same things that Endpoint could. I'm sorry, that SCCM could, and so it confused everybody. So Microsoft renamed SCCM to Endpoint Config Manager, and Intune is now part of that as well. So you have a web-based portal that allows you to control both things. Okay. And so it makes it a whole lot easier, because you can centrally control everything, as opposed to having to jump back and forth. Now, another great thing you get with Endpoint Config Managers, you can do this thing called co-management, where you actually link the two together, and it can control Windows 10 devices, whether they're internal or whether they're out on the internet. They can jump back and forth, and if the Windows 10 device is internal, then Endpoint Config Manager controls it. If the Windows 10 device is out on the internet, then Intune will control it. Okay. Now, another piece of this that I kind of left for the last is a thing called Azure AD. Azure AD is kind of the glue that ties these two things together. Your IaaS and your PaaS are all, and SaaS is all tied together with Azure AD. That is your directory service, and it is a completely different directory service than what we had on premise. On premise, they'll use an acronym called ADDS, which is Active Directory Domain Services, if I could actually spell. All right, Active Directory Domain Services. Okay, wow, lots of typos here. Okay, so ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, that is your on-premise Active Directory. Azure AD is completely different. It's developed with web-based programming. So you're dealing with a lot of your web-based SAML and what's called OpenID and Open Authorization. And it's a different language than what LDAP and Kerberos is built by. Okay. Now you can actually, another thing that's really cool about this is you can actually link the two together and synchronize. So you can actually set up this thing called an Azure AD Connect server. All right. And if you set that Azure AD Connect server up, you can link your on-prem Active Directory with the cloud, and they can synchronize users, groups, passwords, all that stuff between the two. All right. And then you can achieve what is called SSO, single sign-on, where somebody on-premise can actually authenticate on-prem as well as on the cloud at the same time. But just so you know, you get to decide on all that. This is not forced on you. Okay, you get to make that decision, and you also get to decide what gets synchronized. So if you don't want all your users synchronizing, nobody says they have to all be synchronized. You get to decide what's going to get synchronized. Okay. All right, so hopefully that gives you guys a halfway decent understanding now of just the basic foundations of sort of where things were, where we are, and of course, as you can imagine, the cloud is really where Microsoft is heading in the future, and it's definitely where they're putting all their time, effort, and energy. But hopefully that gives you guys a good foundation of how all that works. I'd now like to walk you through and help you understand the concepts of domains, trees, and forests. Now, if you haven't already, it's very important that you go back and watch the foundation videos at the beginning of the course. The foundation videos outline the basic concepts of what a domain is. So this video here is going to assume that you've watched that and that you do have an understanding of the basic concepts of what a domain is, and we're going to kind of expand from there. Okay, so let's talk about domains, trees, and forests. Now, to start out with, one concept I want to get across to you is that this concept of what a forest is. First thing to be aware of is that every single Active Directory domain must be part of this thing called a forest. Okay, as well as a tree. There is no way possible for a domain to not be part of a domain, to not be part of a forest and a tree. Okay, a lot of people think, well, what if you have a single domain? Then it's not part of a tree or forest. You have to have at least two domains to have what's called a tree, and you have to have at least two trees to make a forest. That is not true. That is absolutely not true. Okay, I can tell you I've taught Active Directory design for I think about 21 years of my life. I can tell you that every single domain must be part of a tree and must be part of a forest. If you don't have a tree and a forest when you set up a domain, you will have one when it's all said and done, even if it's just a single domain. So in this diagram that I've got up on the screen, this domain is a domain, a tree, and a forest all rolled into one. It's not a very big tree, it's not a very big forest, but it is a tree and a forest all rolled into one. Okay? Now, ultimately, when most people think of trees and forests, this concept of trees and forests, you generally think of more than one domain. And I'll give you that because that's generally the idea. We want to have a group of domains that make this thing called a tree, and then a group of trees to make this thing called a forest. But let me help you visualize this a little bit more. I'm gonna open up another drawing here, all right? And we'll just start out with this single triangle here. The single triangle is going to represent my examlabpractice.com name. All right, so examlabpractice.com. All right, so at that point, is say this company just got started. This company's just starting up. It's a single domain, but when you set the domain up, it's a domain, a tree, and a forest all rolled into one. Okay. Not a very big tree, not a very big forest, but it is a domain, tree, and a forest. So the question now would be, why would you move into having multiple domains? So there's multiple reasons why you would go to having multiple domains, okay? One reason would be administrative purposes, because your company is spread out through large amounts of geographical locations. For example, my examlabpractice.com part of my company might be based in the United States. Maybe that's where the company got started, and all of that. But the company is expanding and growing. It's moving to different countries in the world. For example, maybe we've got a location that is over in the UK. All right, so we'll draw another little triangle here. This other little triangle is going to represent the United Kingdom. All right, and so maybe we've also got another location in Japan. So our company has spread out to other geographic regions, other parts of the world. And so I'm going to call this domain UK, but when you do that, when it becomes what's known as a child domain, because it's going to be underneath this exam lab practice name, it's going to be called uk.examlabpractice.com. All right. And then if this is going to be the Japan domain, it's going to be called JP. We'll say JP just to be for short, examlabpractice.com. All right. And then these are child domains. They'll have these lines here that are going to represent what are known as trust relationships. Trust relationships allow our domains to share resources together. So these domains here can all exchange and share resources. Now, believe it or not, now you have domain admins that are in control of the UK, but they can only control the UK. You have domain admins Japan can only control Japan. We have domain admins at examlabpractice.com that can only control examlabpractice.com. Although we can have what are called enterprise administrators that can control the whole thing. Okay. Child domains can even have other child domains. So if I wanted to, I could have another triangle maybe underneath the UK here, and we'll call that, maybe it's Scotland. So we'll say scotland.uk.examlabpractice.com. All right. So this is, getting into a bigger organization where you want to have lots of domains. And I will tell you that the more domains you have, the bigger the headache a lot of times. But ultimately, if you need to give full-blown admin control over the different areas of the world, using domains to do that as opposed to something known as an OU might be a better way to do it. Now, I'm not getting into organizational units right now. I'll just say this, that generally speaking, when you start getting into different branches, areas of the world, you got different languages you're dealing with, different time zones. It's a lot of times it's a good idea to just let the admins in those areas of the world have their own domain. But the beauty is these lines here, these trust relationships, they still allow us to share resources together, okay? So right now, what you're actually looking at is you're looking at 4 domains. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're looking at 1 tree and 1 forest. This is not 2 trees. It's not 2 forests. This whole thing is 1 tree. How do I know that these domains are part of the same tree? Because they share the parent's name. If they share the parent's name, which is examlabpractice.com, then they are part of the tree. Okay, now, when would you go to multiple trees? You would go to multiple trees when there is a namespace change. So, for example, if we had another part of our company that had a different naming convention of some sort, then we would expand out to that other name. Okay, for example, I've got examlabpractice.com, and maybe I'm going to call this this other domain. I'll call it prepareforexamsnow.com. And again, I don't really own that domain name. I'm just using that as an example. So it won't do you a whole lot of good to go to that domain name right now because I don't really have any control over it, but I'm just using this as an example. So then we got another triangle here. All right, another domain. Let me just maneuver that a little bit better. All right, we'll put it right here. Now what happens is that you have a trust relationship that connects those triangles together. So now you're actually looking at another tree. So when you have a different domain name that you want to use, that is a different tree. All right. And then from there, if I wanted to have a child domain underneath that, I could. For example, perhaps maybe we've got prepareforexamsnow.com. We have a location that is stored over in Australia. So maybe I call it au.prepare for examsnow.com, and I'll have to move this up a little bit just to, because I don't have enough room. I'll just maneuver this a little bit better. Hang on. All right, and we'll just put the domain name down here like that. All right, and so that indicates now that I've got a total of 6 domains, because there's 6 triangles, right? There's 2 trees, okay? So this is a tree, and this is a tree, and then we have 1 forest, okay? So that's how that works, okay? Now, in order for domains to truly be part of the same forest, they must be born into that forest. You must bring them up. You must join them at the time you, the domain must, you must have started this domain first, and then when you bring this into existence, you would join it into the domain. You can't already have this created and join and truly be part of the same forest. You may say, wait a minute, now what happens if this company already existed and they merged? Well, you can set up something called a trust relationship still, but they're technically 2 different forests. Because when domains are part of the same forest, they share the same schema. The schema is part of the Active Directory database that makes up all of the different objects, all the different attributes. Okay, so when domains are part of the same forest, they can share the following. They can share resources, so that's files and folders. They can access printers, things like that, right? And then they also share the same schema. All right, these are the object templates and attributes and all of that. And I'm not getting too deep into the schema right now, but basically this involves the actual database itself. Now, when 2 different companies merge and they've already got Active Directory, like if Prepare for examsnow.com was another company and they already had their forest set up and we merged, they would not be sharing the same schema. We could set up a forest trust between the 2 and they could share resources, but they would not share the same schema. That means that if you created a special type of object in one forest, it's not going to replicate over to the other forest. Okay. All right. Now the other thing that domains that are part of the same forest will share is they'll share this thing called the global catalog. The global catalog is a part of the Active Directory database that if you're part of the same forest, you share all the global catalog. And this is part of what allows domains to search for objects in different domains. So for example, if I'm in Scotland and I'm trying to look up somebody's user information over in Australia, I could do that, especially if I needed their contact information or something like that, because of this thing called the global catalog that's shared across the entire forest. Okay, not to get too deep into global catalogs right now, I just wanted to give you that basic idea. Okay, so again, just to kind of summarize, every domain must be a part of a domain, a tree, and a forest, even a single domain. Okay, if you can get away with not having multiple domains in your forest, then do it, because it's easier to deal with one domain than it is lots of domains. But if you need to expand because maybe you're spread out all over the world, then that's a good reason to go to multiple child domains. From there, these are all part of the same tree. Now, you don't really need to go to a separate tree in your forest unless you have a namespace difference. So, for example, this name here, Prepare for Exams Now, is a different name, a different domain name. We could go to a separate tree for that. You would still only have one root of the forest, though. The very first domain in the forest is called the root of the forest. This is where your enterprise admins are usually created. Enterprise admins have control over the entire forest, whereas domain admins are user accounts that only have admin rights over just their individual domains. All right? Okay. So hopefully that gives you a decent little understanding now of domains, trees, and forest. Now, something that's important to understand about Active Directory is that Active Directory is a database. And of course, like a lot of other databases out there, Active Directory has these things called partitions. partitions are used to replicate from one domain controller to the other. But the interesting thing about that is you have to consider not just having multiple domain controllers inside the same domain like I've got in my diagram here, but also if I had multiple domains. So when you start branching out into having, multiple child domains and multiple trees, and in discussing kind of how replication is going to occur across those multiple domain controllers when they're spread out like that. So I want to draw a little something out for you now to just kind of help you visualize and understand the concept of the different partitions that we have in a Microsoft domain. So here we are with another drawing, and I am going to, let's say that this is your domain controller right here. So we got domain controller, and that domain controller is has got a database on it. Of course, that database is Active Directory. So let me just make this big cylinder here, and this cylinder is going to represent our Active Directory database. Okay. Okay. In the Active Directory database, let's see, Active Directory DB. The name of that database is actually in a file called ntds.dit. Okay, so that's actually where your database is stored. It's stored inside of a file called ntds.dit on your domain controller. So the Active Directory database, originally many years ago when Windows 2000 came out, there was really only about 3 real partitions that made up Active Directory. Okay, and it was these first 3 here, and I'll tell you what this 4th one is in just a moment. Okay, so the first one is a partition called the config partition, also known as the configuration partition. All right, now the configuration partition, the thing to understand about it is that this partition will replicate to every single domain controller in the entire forest. I don't care if you've got a single domain or you've got 50 domains. A copy of this information replicates forest-wide. So it contains info about how the forest is laid out, all right, is, we'll say configured, all right, and it replicates forest-wide. So every domain controller in the forest gets a copy of this partition, all right, which also means that you don't want to somehow mess that up because you're going to mess it up for the entire forest. All right. The next partition is called the schema partition, and the schema partition is actually a partition that makes up all of the object types and attributes for the entire forest. Okay, so what exactly is that? Well, every time Active Directory goes to create something, if you're going to create a user account or a group or an organizational unit, I don't care what it is, Active Directory communicates with this partition known as the schema, and that's how it knows how to build that object. So when I go to create a user, it's got to go to the schema to know how to build it. It's sort of like made up of all the templates. I always use the analogy of it's like, imagine this big massive box in your head, and in that box says the word schema on the front of it, and then inside that box is a bunch of rolled up blueprints, kind of like the type of blueprints that you might build a house with or something. Okay, and each one of those blueprints is labeled after an Active Directory object, like user account, group policy object, organizational unit. And so when you go to create something, Active Directory goes and it pulls out that blueprint and it knows how to build that object. So the schema is made up of all the different objects and the attributes that go with those objects on how to build objects. So it doesn't store any information about the object. It doesn't store like what the user's name is or password or any of that. It just knows how to build the object. Okay, that's what the schema partition contains. All right, so it contains all object templates and attributes for building objects. This also replicates forest-wide. So every single domain controller in the forest is going to have a replica copy of the schema. Okay. The third partition is called the domain partition, and the domain partition is unique for every domain. So every domain gets their own copy of this partition, and they can add their own objects to it. So this is where all of your user accounts, your passwords, your groups, your organizational units are all stored here, and they're unique for the domain that you're dealing with. So if you look back here, every single domain in this forest has their own unique domain partition. Okay, it's not a shared partition across the forest. They've each got their own unique portion, okay, of this partition. All right, and so this is where all of your different object information is stored. So contains all domain related object information for just this domain. Replicates only to DCs in this domain. All right, so it contains all domain-related object information for just this domain, and it replicates only to DCs in this domain. So, all right, it does not replicate across the forest like some of these other ones do. Okay. All right, so that's important. Now, guys, when this came out in the year 2000, that was it. There was only 3 partitions that existed. Microsoft, when Server 2003 Active Directory came out, they released the ability to create a 4th partition called an application partition. Now, an application partition, this is a custom partition, okay, that you can create, and you can choose what's going to get stored in there, okay? So you get to choose what's going to get stored inside this partition. So if your company was doing, developing applications, and these applications had created special types of objects in Active Directory, and you only wanted certain domain controllers to have a copy of these objects, that's what this is for. To be honest with you, it's not really used that often nowadays. It was something I think Microsoft really thought would take off. It didn't really, though. It's not used by a lot of people out there, though it could be used if you develop custom objects that are going to be stored in Active Directory, and you wanted to pick and choose which DCs are going to replicate this information. So this is a custom partition. If I could spell. Custom partition that you create and choose which DCs get a copy of the information. Okay, so this is a custom partition that you create and choose which DCs get a copy of the information. Now, I will tell you that Active Directory nowadays does come with a couple of these that are built in. One is called the Forest DNS Zone custom partition. The other is called the Domain DNS Zone custom partition, and that gets specifically into DNS and how you want DNS to replicate, which I'm not getting into just this very moment, but essentially what it means is that if Active Directory is hosting its own DNS, which most people do that, you can choose to replicate your entire DNS information across the forest or just a specific domain. And so there's actually a couple of these that tie to Active Directory involving DNS. But ultimately, those are your 3 main partitions right there. This one is a custom one that you can create. There is a couple of built-in ones that Microsoft has. They don't really advertise this a whole lot, but they involve DNS. Now, the last thing that I would like to mention is that you have this thing called the global catalog. The global catalog is a special job you can assign to a domain controller, and when you do that, it will replicate a subset of all the objects in every domain's domain partition. Okay, I'm going to have to lower the font on that just a little bit so it'll all fit in there. But let me say that again. It replicates a subset of all the objects in every domain's domain partition. That's this partition right here. Okay, that's this guy. Now, the global catalog, the purpose of it is so that our different computers can locate objects in those different domains. So if I come over here, it makes it to where I could be in, say, the Scotland domain, and I could look up a user account that exists in Australia. The global catalog is what makes that possible. It does not replicate all the attributes about every object. It just represents a subset of those objects so that the different machines in your domain in Forest can find each other. This doesn't really do a whole lot if you've only got a single domain, because your domain controller knows everybody anyway. But if you spread out to multiple domains, like I had in that other diagram, that's where the global catalog is really going to come into play. All right. So hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding now of the different partitions. This is, again, kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff of happening in Active Directory, but hopefully it helps you understand now what these different partitions are used for. Now, I just wanted to give you a warning. In this next video, I am going to be creating a domain controller, and the domain I'm going to set up for the domain controller is going to be called examlabpractice.com. Now, if you are doing these steps with me, you may want to choose a domain name that's very unique. You don't want to choose examlabpractice.com, because if you eventually do integrate this into the cloud, you don't want to have any kind of a name conflict with me or anybody else. So I would recommend choosing a domain name that is unique to you, that you can play around with, and don't go with examlabpractice.com. Go with a different domain name just to be safe. We're now ready to go ahead and set up a Microsoft Active Directory domain. So here we are on the NYC DC1 virtual machine running Server 2022, and we're going to, when you first go into it, you'll notice that it brings you into Server Manager with this message here. For now, I'm going to close this. Now, if you close out of Server Manager and you don't know how to get back in, all you got to do is hit Start. You'll see Server Manager right there. You can open that back up. And always remember, you'll see a little blue bar kind of going by. You want to wait for that blue bar to kind of stop spinning before you do anything in Server Manager, else sometimes Server Manager will throw a message telling you have to wait. Okay, so if you're wanting to set up Active Directory, there's a few things I want to look at. All right, first I want to click on Local Server, and when I click on Local Server, I can see that my computer name is currently this crazy name here. Okay, and I would like to change that name. I'm going to use a different name instead. So we're going to go ahead and click that, and then that name, and then I'm going to click Change. I'm just going to call this NYC DC1. All right. And currently I am part of a work group. If I was going to join a domain, then I would choose domain. But in my case, I'm going to be starting a domain, creating a domain. So we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to call it NYCDC1. All right. I'm going to click OK. It's going to tell me that I need to reboot my computer. Now, before I reboot my computer, I'm going to say restart later. I'm going to take a look at my IP information. So from there, you'll notice I have Ethernet. It says IPv4. I'm going to click on that. All right, and I'm going to now right-click my Ethernet adapter, go to Properties, and I've got TCP/IP version 4. Okay, for now, I'm just going to disable version 6. I don't want version 6 interfering with anything. I'm just going to disable it for now. I'm going to go to Properties on version 4, and now in the real world, normally I'm going to go with the static address and all that. The problem is if anybody's doing this with me, I don't know what your static IP information is for the network you're on. So I'm just going to leave this set to obtain. But for the DNS, I'm going to point to 127.0.0.1. If you understand basic network concepts, you may know that that's called the loopback address. And it basically allows the computer to point to itself for DNS. Keep in mind that while we're doing this, our server will not have any kind of internet access, but that's okay for what we're doing right now. So we're going to click OK, and we're going to click Close. All right, and we are now officially ready to reboot our computer. So I'm going to go ahead and reboot the machine. So I'm going to right-click Start, shut down, restart, and then I'm going to pause the video while it restarts. Okay, the restart is complete. I've logged back on, and I'm back in Server Manager. I'm going to go to this Manage menu option here and click Add Roles and Features. Okay. All right, so this is the welcome add roles and features wizard. Essentially what it's going to do is allow me to install different roles and features onto my server. So it's just giving me some information here. I'm going to click next. It's asking me if this is going to be a role-based or feature installation. If I'm doing something involving remote desktop, I'm going to choose this first option because it is a role-based, feature-based installation. From there, it's going to let me select if I'm just installing this on one server. Right now it's just this one server. If I had a group of Windows servers, I could actually have multiple servers that I install on at the same time. Okay, but in my case, I'm actually just installing on this one machine for now, so I'm going to click next on that, and then from there I can choose what I want. Okay, so to install Active Directory, the first thing that needs to happen is we need to install Active Directory domain services. So this is this first little option right here. We're going to select that option, click add features, and we're now officially ready to start installing Active Directory. So before we can configure our domain and set our domain up and all that stuff, the first thing we got to do is we've got to install ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. So we're going to click next. There's no additional features. We're just going to have the ADDS, the Active Directory Domain Services role installed. There's no additional features. I'm going to install this very moment. I'm going to click next. All right, at that point it's going to tell us that, hey, you can link this to Azure Active Directory in the cloud. I'm not gonna get into that just this very moment. Right now, we just want to install the on-premise version of Active Directory on this machine. So we're gonna click next, and we're gonna click install, and I'm gonna pause the video while that's installing. I've now got the Active Directory Domain Services role installed. I'm gonna hit close, and up at the top of the screen, you'll notice there's a little yellow exclamation mark. I'm going to click that little yellow exclamation mark, and I'm going to click Promote this server to a domain controller. Okay? All right, so in our case, we are going to be setting up a whole new forest. All right? A forest being a group of domains, and you can have a single domain that creates what's called a forest. A lot of people think you have to have lots of domains for it to be a forest, or at least two. A single domain can actually have a forest. But just to look at these other options real quick, you'll notice the first option says add a domain controller to an existing domain. So if I already had a domain and I wanted to add this server to an existing domain and be a domain controller for that domain, I would choose that first option. The second option says add a new domain to an existing forest. All right, so that means I'm going to set up a whole new domain that's going to be part of a forest. In my case, I don't even have a forest, so I need to start a forest. So we're going to say add a new forest. All right, and so what's the root domain? It's going to be examlabpractice.com. This is my little domain I'm setting up to demonstrate with. So I'm going to click next. At that point, it says, all right, what's the functional level of your forest? Not to get too deep into functional levels this very minute, but the idea of a functional level is as time has gone on over the years of Active Directory coming out, they've released new features. Now, your Active Directory is really only as up to date as its oldest domain controller. So you're kind of pinpointing what level your new domain is going to operate at. As you can see, I can go to my forest, can go all the way from 2008 or higher. My domain, it's going to make me do my domain at 2016 because I've only got one domain controller at this point, and it's going to be a 2022 server. And that's the latest functional level. So they haven't added any more functional levels since Windows Server 2016 has come out. This is the reason why there's not a newer functional level. So as time has gone on, there have been new features that have been added, and essentially I'm telling my Active Directory just how up to date it can be. Okay, so if you had a group of domains like in a forest, and maybe one of the domains was running Server 2008 or something as a domain controller, you would have to choose that. It's really only domain controllers that matter when it comes to functional levels. So I can have, right now, I can be 2016 server functional level for my domain and have like I can still have a Server 2008 server in my domain as long as it's not a domain controller. From there, So specify your domain capabilities, domain controller capabilities. I want to have DNS installed. This server is going to host DNS for my domain. You absolutely must have a DNS server set up. And the second thing is the global catalog. The global catalog is a special server that's going to replicate amongst all the domains in your forest. It's going to replicate certain types of things like universal groups and things like that. Not to get too deep into global catalog servers right now, but that's the idea. It's a special type of server, that a domain controller that's going to replicate amongst multiple domains in a forest if we had multiple domains. Now in our case, we've only got one domain, so it's not a big deal. And then you could choose RODC. Of course, I can't set up a RODC, a read-only domain controller, unless I've actually set up the domain. So this is completely grayed out. I'm not going to get deep into RODC right now either. So understand that some things are going to get explained a little bit later. Okay. So here we go. Then it wants to know the DSRM password. That is the Directory Services Restore Mode Administrator password. This password is used if you need to restore Active Directory from backup. So you're definitely going to want to remember this password. Okay, I'm just going to enter in a password now. And it is possible later down the road, if you want to change this password, you can. Okay, so I'm going to click Next. All right, at that point it says a delegation for DNS can't be found. That's because DNS is not installed on this server yet, but Active Directory should take care of all this for us. So that's fine. We're going to go ahead and click Next to that. Then it's going to say, what do you want your NetBIOS name to be? All right, so your NetBIOS name is an old legacy name for older devices that need to be able to interact with your domain. Hopefully we don't have any older devices in our domain. When I say older devices, I'm talking about like 1990s devices. They would utilize, instead of DNS, they would utilize what was known as NetBIOS names. NetBIOS names can only be up to 15 characters in length. So the reason why we're using this is just in case we had some older devices in our environment. To be honest with you, in the real world, it's a good idea, once you set this up, to just completely disable NetBIOS altogether if you don't have any older devices, because it is a bit of a security risk to continuously allow NetBIOS naming. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click Next. All right, and it's going to go through and just double check and make sure that there isn't a conflict out there on our network, and there is not. So the next thing is it's going to ask us where our database and logs are going to be. So the Active Directory database is stored in a file called ntds.dit, and that gets stored by default on the C drive/Windows ntds folder. Your logs are as well. You have what are known as database transaction logs that log every single thing that's going on in the Active Directory database. And you've got what's called a sysvol folder. The sysvol folder is where group policy information and logon scripts are stored. It's actually, if you want better performance out of your computer, out of your domain controller, it's actually a good idea to store your database and logs on a separate hard drive. So put your database on one hard drive, put your logs on another hard drive. If you have two hard drives in your server, you'll get a slightly better performance boost out of your database and log interaction. All right. All right, so now I'm going to click Next to that, and it's going to tell me everything it's going to do. Now, I would like to point out too, you can see what it's doing. It's actually going to use PowerShell in the background to install Active Directory. So if we click View Script, you can see the PowerShell command that's actually being ran. Import-module ADDS deployment. So it's pulling the Active Directory deployment commands into memory. It's running the install-ADDS forest command, meaning you're setting up a new forest. It's calling the create DNS delegation parameter false. I'm not delegating anything here for DNS. It's actually installing DNS on this machine. The database, it's specifying the database path with this parameter, specifying the domain mode. It's basically going with the highest functional mode. That's what that's doing. You have the domain name, examlabpractice.com. The NetBIOS name, the forest, it's using the latest functional level for the forest, just like it is for the domain. It's installing DNS, set to true, specifying the log path, says no reboot on completion, false. Okay, so it's a no reboot, and then it's installing the sysvol folder here, and it's going to go ahead and force it just to, if it pops any messages up, just force it to say true to that. So that's going to be the PowerShell command. You could copy this PowerShell command to something like the integrated scripting environment, and you could run this as like a cookie cutter on multiple machines if you wanted to. Granted, you don't want any kind of conflict, but if you wanted to set up multiple domains for practice, you could do that if you needed to. All right, so I'm going to go ahead now and click Next. It's going to verify all the prerequisites are met and let me know if there's any kind of error messages or anything like that, or any kind of warnings that it's ran across. It's going to let me know anything there. Okay, so Windows domain controllers, they tell you have default security settings, allow cryptography algorithms compatible with Windows NT. That's basically telling you that it is going to support an older type of encryption to allow old NT servers from the 1990s to interact with the domain. It's in your best interest from a security standpoint. You can control these through policies. You can disable some of that to increase security. So the next message is this computer has at least one physical network adapter, but that does not have a static address. Now in the real world, you would want your domain controller to have a static address so the address doesn't change, ideally. I already mentioned though earlier that I don't really know what kind of address that if you're doing this with me, I don't know what your address is for your network. So in my case, I chose to use a dynamic address, which means it'll get an address from the DHCP service on your network, which is fine for lab purposes. The main thing is we want to make sure we're pointing to ourselves for DNS, and that's what this little message here is involving. It's telling you that DNS is not set up. However, Active Directory is going to install DNS for us so that we have a database going. All right, so from there it says the prerequisites are complete and we are ready to install. It says everything's passed successfully, so we're ready to install. I'm going to go ahead and click the install button, and this is going to take just a moment. I'm going to pause the video and let it finish up. Okay, after the wizard completes the installation, the domain controller will reboot, and at that point you'll come to your logon screen here and you'll notice it says Exam Lab Practice /Administrator. That means I'm logging on to the domain as opposed to the local user account. I'm just going to go ahead now and put my password in, and it's going to officially log me on to the domain controller. Okay, I'm now back in Server Manager after I log on. Let's just verify a few things. We're going to click on Local Server. All right, from there, we're going to notice that computer name is NYCDC1, domain is examlabpractice.com. Okay, we're going to go to the Tools menu, and we're going to open up DNS, and we're just going to verify that our DNS database is there. Okay, so NYCDC1, forward lookup zones, examlabpractice.com. That's exactly what we want to see right there. We want to see that database. And then if we click on the underscore TCP and UDP, we have service records that are created. These records are needed in order for the Active Directory services to run properly. And so everything seems to be in order. We now have, if we go up to the Tools menu, we have our Active Directory tools, such as Active Directory Users and Computers, where we create user accounts and all that fun stuff. So our domain controller is now officially set up. I hope you're enjoying the content so far. I wanted you to know that I'm trying really hard to build this channel, and it would help me out so much if you would take the time to like and subscribe to the channel. All right, and with that said, let's get back to the video. It's now time to join our second server to our Microsoft domain. So we have NYCDC1, which is up and running right now as a domain controller, and we have NYC Server 1 that is currently not a member of any domain. So let's take a look at that server right now. Here we are on NYC Server 1, and I'm just going to hit Start. All right, and from there we'll go to Server Manager. First thing we're going to do is take a look at the name of the server. Okay, not going to get into the Windows Admin Center right now. Wait on the little bar to quit spinning by here in Server Manager. Once that's done, I'm going to click on Local Server. So you can see the name is this name here. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and change the name. So I'm going to call it NYC SVR1. Okay, I'm going to go ahead now and let the computer reboot before I try to join the domain. I've had some issues in the past with doing that, so we're just going to go ahead and tell it to restart. Okay, after it rebooted, I've logged back on and Server Manager reappears. I'm going to close that, go over to Local Server, and notice the name is now NYC SVR1, but I'm still part of a work group. Now, This is very important. In order for me to join the domain, I need to make sure that my DNS settings on this machine are pointed to the domain controller, because the domain controller is our DNS server that is going to be needed in order for me to join the domain. So I'm going to jump over to NYCDC1. So here we are. This is NYCDC1. I'm going to open up Server Manager, and I'm going to go Tools, and I'm going to go to, actually, you know what? I'm going to go to Command Prompt. So I'm going to type CMD, go to Command Prompt, type ipconfig. Okay, and that is my IP address, 192.168.1.5. If you're doing this with me as well, you need to find out what your IP address is, and you need to write that number right there down, okay? Whatever it is. I don't know what it is for you, but for me it's 192.168.1.5, okay? So once I've got that written down, I'm going to jump back over to Server 1. So here we are. We're back on Server 1. Okay, we're going to go right here on Local Server, Ethernet IPv4. Okay, we're going to right click the Ethernet adapter. Okay, I'm going to disable IPv6 on it. Highlight v4, TCP IP version 4, go to Properties, and I'm going to point to 192.168.1.5. So again, that should match what you've got on your domain controller right now. So unlike, we're not going to put 127.0.0.1 like we did for our domain controller, because we're not pointing to ourselves. We want to point to the domain controller. From there, we're going to click OK. We're going to click Close. All right, we can close out of this screen, and we're now ready to join the domain. Okay, so currently on local server, you'll see we're part of a work group. We're going to click where it says work group right there. All right, we're going to click right here where it says change, and we're going to switch to a domain. We're going to put examlabpractice.com. That's what I'm putting because that's what my domain is called. In your case, you may have a different domain. You would need to put in whatever that name is. I'm going to click OK. Okay, it wants to know what my credentials are. I'm going to put examlabpractice \administrator, and then I'm going to put the password in. If everything went through successfully, you should get this message here, welcome to the domain. You got to make sure again that you're pointing to the domain controller for DNS. That is critical. All right, that's where most everybody messes up, is they don't point themselves to the domain controller. They point to their ISP for DNS or whatever, and at that point it's not going to work. You got to point to the domain controller for DNS. At that point, we're going to click OK. Going to click Close. We're going to tell it to restart, and I'll pause the video while it's restarting. Okay, so once it's done restarting, you may come to a screen like this. I'm going to say Other User, though, and then I'm going to put examlabpractice/administrator, \administrator. This is going to let me log on to the domain administrator account instead of the local administrator account. We're going to hit Enter, and it's now officially logging us on to the examlabpractice domain. And I've officially joined the server to the domain. We can go now over to Active Directory on our domain controller, and we can verify that the server is showing up in our Active Directory environment. So we're going to jump back over to NYCDC1. Okay, so here's NYCDC1, as you can see. All right, I'm going to go up here to, I'm in Server Manager. I'm going to go to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. All right, expand out the examlabpractice.com name. I'm going to click on Computers, and you guys can see NYC Server 1 is showing up. Remember, NYC Server 1 in this case is not a domain controller at the moment. It is just a member server. All right, the only domain controller we've got in our environment right now is NYCDC1. Okay, and we can see that by clicking on this little domain controller's organizational unit, OU. All right, and then there's NYC Server 1. All right, so we've officially joined the domain, and we've got the two machines able to communicate together. I now want to look at how we can log on to Azure and set up a virtual machine in the cloud that could be a domain controller for us. So if you wanted, you could bypass doing an on-premise domain controller. You could set up a domain controller right out in the cloud, just as though it was something that was hosted on premise. So how do we do that? Well, first, and foremost, you need to have gone through the earlier videos where I demonstrate how to set up your Microsoft 365 and Azure account. There's another video that shows you how to set up an Azure subscription. So you need to make sure you've watched those and done those before you try to attempt this yourself. Else, you are welcome to just watch me do it. But if you want to try it yourself, you need to make sure you've done those earlier steps. Okay, here I am on portal.azure.com. Okay, I'm going to go to this little menu button here, and I'm going to go to resource groups, and I'm going to create a little resource group. So a resource group is just a little container that you can put virtual machines and other Azure objects inside. So I'm going to call this resource group, I'm just going to call it VM test. All right, you can name it what you want for the most part, although there are rules on you can't have spaces and things like that. If I try to put a space, you'll notice it'll give an error. But I'm going to call it VM test, and then I'm going to specify the region. I'm going to put East US. You would obviously want to put a region near where you live because that's going to involve the data center where the virtual machine files are going to stay. Okay, I'm going to click review and create, and then click to create, and the resource group will get created relatively quickly. Okay, so I'm going to go into the VM test resource group, and I'm going to create a resource in the resource group. That's going to be a virtual machine. So I'm going to click create. All right, and then it gives me some options here for setting up virtual machines if I want. And if I want, what I can do is just do a search. We'll say Windows Server 2022. Let's do a search on that. See what our options are. All right. And so from there, it says, okay, you're going to do a Windows Server. Yep, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm going to do a Windows Server, and let's go ahead and just click on this box here. It says, okay, which version of Windows do you want? So I'm going to go down. We're going to go with Windows 2022 Server. It'll be Data Center. Okay, so we'll go with Data Center. Okay, we're going to click to create. All right. We got our Azure subscription. We are pointing to the VM test resource group where we want it to be created. All right, I'm going to call this virtual machine name is going to be called Azure DC1. Okay, that's just what I'm going to give it a name of. Of course, you can name it what you want. All right. Now keep in mind, this is not my full-blown, I'm not doing a full-blown Azure lecture right now, so some of this stuff I'm not really going to get into thoroughly right now. But like availability zones, not going to talk deep about these right now. This is going to get into having your virtual machine replicated to other data centers in the Azure cloud, so that if one data center goes down, you got a replica of your virtual machine in another data center. Okay, so that's going to involve this availability options, availability zones. Not going to get into all that right now. Could have 3 different data centers, regions, and all that we could get into. The security type, not going to get deep into this right now either. This is whether or not you're going to support TPM, a trusted platform module on the server or not, which is going to allow things like BitLocker encryption, secure boot features, things like that. So this involves adding additional security. Keep in mind that some of this stuff does cost a little extra money. Now, if you're concerned about the cost, you can always go out to just do a quick Google search for the word Azure Calculator. And if you do that, you can go to the Azure Pricing Calculator. And this is a great way to kind of find out what the cost of something is. It'll let you go through the process of simulating setting up, say, a virtual machine or some other Azure related appliance or service or something like that, and then it'll give you like a price estimate as to what the cost is. So you can go here to this pricing calculator, you can check that out and find out what the cost of some of the resources are. So here's, for example, I can click on virtual machine, and then I can add some of the things I want. It's going to try to give you an estimate like on a monthly basis on what the cost would be. So this is definitely something that's fun to play around with to get an idea of what the cost will be. So I definitely encourage you to come here and play around with the calculator and see what you can find out. Okay, so back over here, we're going with the image we're going with is Windows Server 2022 Data Center Generation 1. You can look at other images. We're not going to do Azure Spot Image. Spot Image, though, is an affordable thing you can do for testing. It's going to essentially make it where the hardware that's used in the data center will be unused based hardware. So hardware that's currently not being used buy a bunch of other equipment. It's a lot of times it could be slower hardware, it could be faster hardware. This is the spot instance, though, is a great way for you to test things out at a very low cost. I'm not going to do spot instance. Keep in mind, spot instance, they could shut your virtual machine down if all the equipment starts getting used in the data center. Okay, so then I got size. This is how much the average would be per month. Okay, so you can see right now it's saying that with one virtual CPU, 3.5 gigs of RAM, $91.98 a month, and then for 4 virtual CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM is going to cost more. You can also see all sizes if you want. It'll give you this little size table here, and you can get an idea of what the cost is going to be per month. Okay, all right, I'm just going to go with the default one and select that. So that'll be the one virtual CPU, 3.5 gigs. Keep in mind, I'm not going to leave this virtual machine up, so it's not going to cost a lot of money. I'm just doing this for demo purposes. So from there, at that point, I can say, okay, what do you want your username to be? I'm going to call it Azure Admin, and then I'm going to put a password in that I want to use. Okay. And of course, if you're doing this with me, you can put whatever you want there. Okay, then it's going to talk about inbound port rules. It's going to add some rules to the firewall services on there so that it can allow a connection in. So virtual machines are going to be tied to what's called a virtual network. The virtual network has what's known as a network group, and this network group is almost like a little firewall service that's going to monitor the incoming traffic. Also keep in mind that in the real world, if I'm going to support remote desktop protocol coming in, eventually what you're going to want to do is set up like a VPN, because it's a lot more secure than just allow RDP open on the server, because hackers could do a port scan and determine that 3389 is open, and they could try to attack your server. So it's better eventually for you to set up a VPN and VPN into all this. Of course, I'm not getting into VPNs right now. I just wanted to kind of throw that out. Okay, at that point you can click next, and you can select how you want your hard drives to be. You can do premium solid state. I'm just going to go with standard HDD, which is cheaper. It's not as fast as solid state, but standard. Okay, not getting into any of the encryption stuff right now. Okay, networking, you could set up your virtual network. It's going to configure a little virtual network that the server is going to sit on. If I had other virtual machines, I could join them to this virtual network. So I'm not thoroughly getting into all this right now either. Okay, I'm just going to click Review and Create. All right, it's going to bring us to the Review and Create screen. It's going to tell me if there's any problems, and it says the validation passed. So apparently there's no problems. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to create the virtual machine. And this can take a few minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this is processing through. Okay, so after a few minutes, you should get a confirmation message here. As you can see, it says your deployment is complete. I could click Go to the resource, but if you want to know how to find it through the menu, you can click the menu button here on portal.azure.com, go down to Resource Groups, and then VM Test here, and then I can see all the items that make up the virtual machine. As you can see, there's a lot of different things that make up a virtual machine. You have the actual virtual machine object itself, which is this Azure DC1. You have a virtual IP address. You have this network security group, which is for packet filtering. It's basically almost like a firewall, kind of, sort of. You got a network interface adapter, and then you got your virtual disk here, and then here is the VNet itself, the virtual network. So what we really care about here is this Azure DC1 object. I'm going to click on that, and that is going to give me the address of the virtual machine itself. Here it is right here. This is the IP address of it, so I'm just going to copy that. All right, and at that point I can click Connect, and it'll let me connect RDP, SSH, Bastion. RDP is what we told it to use. So we could just tell it to download RDP file if we want. Okay, so I'm going to open up this file. All right, at that point I'm going to put in my credentials. And then I'm going to hit enter. All right, click yes to log on, and I'm now connecting to the virtual machine through RDP. Okay, so it's now officially starting up just like a server normally does. Just like if you've installed a domain controller on premise, this is pretty much the exact same process. But currently, this is just a server, a standalone server. It has not got Active Directory or any of that installed on it. So we would have to install the Active Directory domain services and all that in order for that to happen. Okay, so now that I've got Server Manager up, I'm going to just close out of this right here. All right, and I'm going to go over here to local server. You guys can see that the name of the server is Azure DC1, right? You can see the IP address information here. If I click on that, go to the properties of the virtual adapter. Going to point to this computer loopback address 127.0.0.1. I'm going to point the computer to itself for DNS. All right. Going to go now up to, in Server Manager, we're going to go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. Going to install Active Directory Domain Services. Next. Next. And next, and I'm now ready to install. Okay, so I'm going to let that install. I'll pause the video while that's installing. Now that the installation is complete, I'm just going to hit close, and I'm ready to configure and promote this to a domain controller. So I'm just going to go here to promote this server to a domain controller. All right, if I was going to create a new forest, I could. Keep in mind, if we actually established a connection from our on-premise network to the cloud, and you can do that using something called Direct Connect. You can use a VPN. There's actually various ways you can connect your on-premise network directly into the Azure cloud. We're not getting into that right now, but I could, if I did that, I could actually join this computer with on-premise, with the on-premise domain. Not getting into that right now, but because right now the main thing is I want to show you how to set up a new domain controller in the forest. But the cool thing about that is it is possible to connect your on-premise with the cloud, or you can go full-blown into the cloud and just host all your domain controllers out in the cloud. All right, so I would say add a new forest, give it a name. I'm going to call this Exam Lab Practice Azure.com. That's the name I'm going to give it. And then next. All right, so it's just checking. Got your forest functional levels, domain functional levels. All right, DNS, I'm going to point to myself for DNS. It's going to be a global catalog, not looking at RODC right now. Put in the password that I want my directory services restore mode administrator to be. Click next. Okay, it's going to delegate DNS. It's going to point to this computer for DNS, so that's fine. We'll click next on that. Okay, then it's going to check to make sure there's no NetBIOS name conflict out there. It's going to use the default NetBIOS name, which will be no more than a 15-character name. All right, so I'm going to click next. Alrighty, and that's done. So we'll just leave the database log folder and sysvol folder in the same place. Next, and we're ready to go. Going to click next. It's going to check the prerequisites, make sure there's no issues there. Once it's done with that, we will be able to install the machine or promote the machine up to a domain controller, and it'll officially be a domain controller. And there we go. And it's going to take a few minutes to do that, and we'll pause the video and come back. Okay, so after Active Directory is set up and the domain controller is officially there and promoted, it is going to do a reboot, and so you'll get kicked off of the remote desktop session. You'll have to connect back in. And the first boot of a domain controller sometimes is a little sluggish, especially when it's only got like 3 gigs of RAM, 3.5 gigs of RAM or so. So you'll notice it's a little bit slow. But once that's booted back up, you can see here I am in Server Manager, and I now officially have Active Directory installed. I can go right here and I can open up Active Directory users' computers, and we can create user accounts and stuff in our little domain. So we're good to go. And that is how you can set up a domain controller in the Azure Active Directory or the Azure environment. Now, the only other thing that I would recommend that you do, because I'm not going to be really messing with that domain controller anymore right now, I'm going to go ahead and turn that domain controller off so that it's not using my Azure credit, my subscription. So here I am back on portal.azure.com. I'm going to click the little menu button. I'm going to go to resource groups. And then from there, we're going to go to the VM test resource group. We're going to locate the Azure DC1. We're going to go ahead and click on that. And then we're just going to tell it to stop. All right. So we're going to go ahead and tell it to stop. And that's going to go ahead and just shut it down. And it's no longer going to be taking up processing power or any of that in the cloud. So it won't be costing us any money. All right. So that's the only other thing I recommend you do. And then you're officially ready to move on now. Now, for years, Windows Server domain controllers have supported a feature known as RODC. RODC is a read-only domain controller. And it was kind of funny because back in the 1990s when we had Windows NT Server, you had what was called a PDC, a primary domain controller, and you had what was called BDCs, backup domain controllers. And the PDC was writable and the BDCs were read-only. And then Microsoft, when Windows 2000 came out, they made this announcement that all domain controllers are now writable. So it was a pretty big deal because it meant that you could sit down at any of your domain controllers and essentially it would replicate to the other domain controllers. Not too long after that, a few years down the road, Microsoft released the concept of what is called RODC. RODC is read-only domain controller. And the idea is that we can set up a domain controller that is not writable, that is only read-only. But the question is, why? That's probably what you're wondering. So I want to kind of explain that a little bit. So to help you understand that, I'm going to pop open another drawing here, and we're going to take a look at some different locations. So, for example, perhaps our main location might be in New York City. All right, New York City. And then maybe we've got, we'll just say New York. And maybe we've also got another location which we'll say is in, how about Texas? Maybe Dallas, Texas. Okay, so Dallas. All right, and maybe we've also got another location over here in, let's make it Birmingham, Alabama. I'm just going to put Birm for Birmingham, Alabama. Okay. And maybe, you've got some connections that connect these offices together, some wide area network connections that connect these offices together, and you've got domain controllers in each one of your locations. We'll say New York, we've got domain controller in New York, maybe a couple domain controllers in New York, all right, and maybe a couple domain controllers in Dallas, all right, so that'll represent those. Now, we're going to say that Birmingham is a relatively new office, and it's a very small office, okay? So, whereas New York, maybe we've got like 500 employees, we got different departments working there. Maybe in Dallas, we've got like, I don't know, we'll say 300 employees, okay? But in Birmingham, it's just a small, let's say like a sales office, okay? So this is really just a sales office where we have salespeople maybe that meet with different customers. And perhaps maybe there's only like, I don't know, we'll say 10 employees that work there, and there's not even a full-time IT department or full-time IT staff that actually works in that Birmingham office. Okay, so this is where we get into why RODC might be beneficial, okay? First off, you have IT people that work full-time in New York, IT people that work full-time in Dallas. There is somebody there monitoring domain controllers and managing everything in those locations for us at all times, okay? But when we get into our Birmingham office, it's just a small office. It might even be that it's not well monitored. It's not, again, there's no IT people there monitoring anything. They're not managing everything and keeping everything safe. So it's a little bit more dangerous to put a full-blown domain controller in that Birmingham office. But here's the problem. Computers that are logging on in Birmingham, let's say that this box here represents one of the client computers. That client computer, when he wants to authenticate with the domain controller, currently he's having to cross over to New York using the company's WAN connection or whatever in order to do that. And maybe users are complaining that it's slow. So we could, of course, put a full-blown domain controller and set it up over in the sales office in Birmingham, but at that point, you got to remember something. These domain controllers are all writable. If you make a change to one of them, it's going to replicate back and forth, right? That means that if we were to put a domain controller, a full-blown domain controller in Birmingham, and something got corrupted because there's not IT staff there monitoring it and managing it all the time, that could replicate to New York, and next thing you know, it's in Dallas. It's replicated across the entire domain, and it could corrupt the entire domain. Okay, so a RODC would be a good fit for this style of environment. So instead of putting a full-blown DC, we're going to put a RODC out there. So we're going to put a server, we're going to make it a RODC server, okay? So it won't be a full-blown DC. RODCs are they're read-only. So that means that replication, when it occurs, it's going to occur this way, okay? Now the other thing that's great about RODC is that you can have it cache the passwords of the 10 employees that are in the office. It does not have to know everybody's password. So there's a security scenario there as well, if you think about it, to where I'm going to allow this RODC to cache the password of the 10 employees that work there, but no other passwords. So if somehow this RODC server got hacked, it's not going to know anybody's admin passwords or any of that. Okay. Now you can control that through using the password objects, password caching feature that RODC has. So we get to control what RODC is going to know. And again, replication will never occur out here. It'll always have to occur incoming to RODC. So when things change, it's going to replicate to RODC. RODC does not ever get to replicate anything out. So again, if it gets corrupted or something like that, it's not going to do any damage. Okay, we get to control all of that. All right. So ultimately, RODC can act as a way for you to set up a domain controller that's read-only, not give anybody access to it. In fact, it doesn't even know any admin credentials. So you may say, what happens if an admin visits the Birmingham office and tries to log on? Anybody that tries to log on, if RODC does not know their password, then RODC will do pass-through authentication. It means it'll send the authentication request up to New York, in this case, and New York will authenticate the user and pass it back. So if anybody tries to log on and it doesn't know their password, they can still get authenticated, it's just a little slower. Else, we could manually tell RODC that we want it to cache a certain person's password. But ideally, you don't really want it caching like admin passwords and things like that. Because of the fact that this server is not thoroughly being monitored as much as the others, because there's not an IT department or there's not IT staff working there, then ultimately what you're doing is you're making it where it only knows about the 10 employees that work in the office. Okay, so guys, that is the idea of RODC. That is how RODC could benefit us. It's not used super duper often in the real world. There are certain circumstances where it can come in handy, but you can put DNS on that as well, by the way. So another thing that's handy is you can have DNS set up on it, and your employees can query using DNS and all that right there with RODC as well. All right, but remember, RODC is read-only, and it's only going to be used in certain circumstances. Now, I'd like to show you a couple different ways that we could set up a RODC, all right, a read-only domain controller. The first method I'm going to show you is known as just pre-staging a RODC server. Now, this is the way you would do things if you have not set up a server yet that's going to be your RODC server, but you plan on setting up a server that's going to be your RODC server in the future. Okay, so perhaps you are located in New York, but you've got a office in Birmingham, Alabama that's really small. It's only got 10 people, and you're going to be maybe sending a server down there or shipping a server down there, and you just want to be able to plug it in and have somebody just step through configuring it real quick. Then you could do that. You wouldn't even have to be present when this promotion occurs if you do what's called pre-staging. So let me show you how pre-staging works. All right, here we are on NYC DC1. This is our domain controller, and we're going to open up Server Manager. Of course, you can click Start and go to Server Manager if you don't know how to get in there. Okay, from there we're going to go to the Tools menu and we're going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers. Okay, so we're going to bring up Active Directory Users and Computers now, and from there you'll notice you have the OU, the Organizational Unit, which is a folder here that's going to contain domain controllers, and currently we only have one domain controller. So if we wanted to do what's called pre-staging a RODC, we can right-click that container, and you'll see an option that says pre-create a read-only domain controller. Now remember, you can't just right-click anything. It's got to be that container, domain controllers. Okay, so we're going to click to pre-create RODC account. Okay, we're going to click next on the welcome screen. It says, okay, which privileges, which credentials are you going to use to do this? So I'm going to use my administrator credentials in order to do this. All right, specify the account credentials to use in the installation. Okay, so that's going to be my admin credentials. You could specify some alternative credentials if you wanted to. All right, but we're going to use the ones that we have signed in. All right, so we're going to click next. It says, okay, what do you want the computer name to be? Okay, I'll name it, I'm just going to call it RODC test. This is just a demo anyway. Okay, so RODC test. All right, I'm going to click next. It's going to verify there's not already a computer out there named RODC test. There cannot be a computer out there with this name right now. You have to remember, you're pre-staging this, so you're setting this up before you even have a server configured yet. Okay, then it says, which site do you want to go with? I'm not explaining Active Directory sites right now, so we're just going to go with this default site. Okay, not explaining sites at the moment. This would be the location. Technically, I'll say that if you had a location in Birmingham, Alabama, you might have a Birmingham site. You would specify that, but I'm not going to explain that right now. I'm going to hit next. Okay, it's going to check DNS information. All right, and essentially just verifying if there's a DNS name out there. If there's a certain IP address or something that goes with this, then at that point it will pop that up. Of course, you can also speed this process up by disabling your network adapter card. It won't take as long, which sometimes I get annoyed by it taking so long. So if I want to cause this to get done quickly, what I'll do is I'll go right here to Ethernet, change adapter options, and I'll just disable the NIC real quick and then re-enable it, and that will trigger it to finish a little quicker. As you can see, it's done now. Sometimes it can take like 5 minutes for it to finish, and this way it just kind of gets it to skip searching DNS a whole lot. Okay, do you want to put DNS on the RODC? You can. Do you want it to be global catalog server? You can. I'm not going to make it be a DNS, but I will allow it to be global catalog. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click next. All right, it says, all right, so this is important right here. This is very important. This says, the user or group that you specify will be able to attach a server to the RODC account that you are creating now and complete the RODC installation. They will also have local administrative privileges. Okay, so imagine if I was, if somebody in Birmingham, Alabama, I'm in New York City, okay, we have Birmingham, Alabama, and we just have like 10 people that work in that office, and they're all salespeople. So they're not like IT savvy people. However, I could specify one of their names. Let's say it's the sales manager, whoever that is, and I could give them admin privileges just locally on this server so they can help me configure this server once we have the server in that office. Because literally what I'm wanting to happen is I'm wanting somebody to basically just be able to plug the server in, and they'll be able to install ADDS with these admin privileges, and it's going to finish doing everything. They're not going to have to configure anything. All they got to do is a couple of clicks, and it's going to finish. So that's what this is going to do. This is going to give an account the authority to do that. All right. Now in my case, I'm just going to put myself in there. So I'm just going to choose myself. But in the real world, if you had somebody in that office you wanted to point to, you could. All right. At that point, I'm going to click next, and we're going to click next again, and we've officially created a little pre-staged RODC account. Okay, so at that point, you would be able to set up a server, and as long as you named it RODC test, RODC-test, and you join the domain, that person in that office could log in with their credentials and they could finish the setup. All they got to do is a couple of clicks and it's officially set up. This was, in the earlier 2000s, this was, considered beneficial for, to have this kind of connection set up. To be honest with you, almost nobody ever uses this anymore to set up a RODC. Most everybody, if they're going to set up a RODC, they can do it remotely using remote desktop, or they would just install the RODC locally and they would just ship the server down to the office. And that would be an easy way to deal with it. Okay. Now, alternatively, something else I want to show you here. You'll notice the little black arrows pointing down. That's just to indicate that currently there has been no server that has occupied this yet. You'll notice it says unoccupied. So the server hasn't gotten control of it yet. But the other thing I want to show you, if we right-click this object and we go to properties here, you're going to see the password replication policy. Okay, so this is where I can go and I can specify which accounts it's going to cache for password authentication in that office. So currently, you're going to say it's going to deny everybody except one group. So if I had a salesperson, I could put that salesperson into this allowed RODC password group, and that anybody that's in that group, it's going to synchronize their password unless they're an admin, unless there's a deny. Okay, so I don't have any additional users, but I'll show you. Like, I'll just create one real quick. We'll call this let's see, John Smith. Logon name is going to be just John Smith. All right, let me put password in for the user. Okay, and we won't make the user change password right now. We're going to put John Smith in that group. So if you'll notice, you have that group. Let's go right here to John Smith. We're going to click member of. We're going to do a quick search for the word password. Oops, actually, easiest thing to do. Let's just say find now. All right, and you'll see the allowed RODC password replication. So we're going to double click on that, click OK, and he's now a member of that group. So John Smith, who maybe John Smith is, he's in that office, the Birmingham office. All right. And he is maybe like a sales manager or something. So he's in that group. It's going to cache his credentials. So that is how you configure RODC so that it will cache somebody's credentials. Okay, so the other way that you could have done this is just to go straight over to the server. Okay, so I have NYC server 1 right now, and I could jump over to that server. Let's jump over. Here we are. This is NYC server 1. He is not a domain controller. Okay, I could go ahead and say manage, add roles and features, next, next, next. And we're going to install Active Directory just like we would a normal domain controller. Okay, so next, 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 and install. We'll give that a moment and let it install. Okay, once ADDS is done installing, you can just click OK to that. At that point, we're going to go up to this little warning symbol. We're going to click Promote the server to a domain controller. All right, and it's going to say add a domain controller to an existing domain. RODC, of course, is going to be joined to an existing domain, so that is definitely going to be the object or the option that we go with. All right, from there, we're going to go ahead and click Next. All right, now, warning, if you get an error message, if you're doing this with me and you get an error message just trying this out, it usually means that your computer is no longer pointing to the domain controller for DNS. So what you need to do is you need to jump over to the domain controller. You need to go to command prompt. You need to do an ipconfig and find out what the address is of your domain controller. Jump back over to the server. You'll go up here to local server. Okay, go back over here to your Ethernet assigned by DHCP. Just click on that. Go to the properties of your adapter and verify that you've got the correct address in right here. It's very important. If you don't, you're going to get an error. Okay, that's if you're doing this with me. Okay, so we're just gonna, we could have a DNS installed on this machine, we could global catalog, and this is where we can choose RODC right here. So at that point, we could choose RODC, directory services restore mode, password, just like we've done before. We can click next. All right, we can specify, it says accounts that will be allowed to replicate. We can go ahead and specify the account passwords that are going to be replicated and cached. We can specify those if we want. All right, says, okay, you want to replicate with any domain controller. That's fine. By the way, you can, if you have a backed up copy of Active Directory, you can do install from media to let you specify the backed up copy of Active Directory. That's a great way to save time if you're replicating a large, big database across a slow connection. If you had a copy of it of Active Directory on a flash drive, even if it's an out-of-date copy, it'll update once it's done. So I'm gonna go ahead and click next now. We can specify our database log location, and at that point, we're now officially ready to pull the trigger. It would do the prerequisite check, and we would click install. We've got ourselves a RODC. I'm not actually going to do that to this server because I have other usage for this, other usage for this server that I want to use it for. But now you've seen exactly how you can set up a RODC server. I'd now like to convert NYC Server 1 to a domain controller, and even though I did call it NYC Server 1, I'm going to leave the name the same, but it is going to now be promoted to an additional domain controller in my examlabpractice.com domain. Now if I open up Server Manager, okay, open up Server Manager, from there I've actually already installed ADDS. And if you don't know how to do that, you just do that through Manage, Add Roles and Features, Next, 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 and then you choose Active Directory Domain Services, and then it's going to install, okay, once that's done. So once you've done that, at that point, we're going to promote. So we're going to go here, we're going to say promote the server to a domain controller. We're going to say add a domain controller to an existing domain, all right? Keep in mind, if I wanted to set up another child domain of the forest, I could, or a whole new forest, I could. Okay, so I'm going to go with that option. Okay, from there it says specify domain controller capabilities and site information. If I want, I could install this as a DNS server. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to point to NYC DC1 as my DNS. So I'm going to turn that off. And then if I want to make this a global catalog server, I can. I'll just leave that selected. I'm not going to make this a RODC. Okay, there's only one site that all this belongs to. I'm not really explaining sites a whole lot right now. That's going to represent the geographic location of where this is at, but not getting into sites at this very moment. Okay, going to put in the directory services restore mode password. This is the password that we would use to recover Active Directory if we needed to. Going to click next. It says, okay, you're going to set up the domain controller. You're going to replicate from any domain controller or from NYC DC1. Well, there's only one other domain controller, so really doesn't matter what option I choose here. Now I can do install from media. If I had a backed up copy of Active Directory, like on a USB drive or something, I could install from media. And again, the reason why this is good is in a situation where perhaps you had a really slow connection and you had a copy of Active Directory backed up, and you had a very large Active Directory database and you don't want it to replicate across that slow connection, the whole thing, you could install from media. That's not an option that's used very often, but it could come in handy in certain circumstances. So from there, we'll click next. I'm going to leave the database log and sysfile folder in the default location. We're going to review options. We could look at our PowerShell command here, as you can see. And then from there, I'm going to click next. It's going to check the prerequisites and everything is clear. We're going to go ahead and click install. And I'll pause the video while that's happening and finish up. Okay, so now Active Directory is officially set up on this machine. It's been promoted now to a domain controller. Keep in mind, when the wizard finished, it did a reboot. So if you do this along with me, you'll notice that you'll have to reboot your domain controller, and then you can log back on and you'll be where I'm at. So at that point, I now should be able to click Tools. I should be able to go into Active Directory Users and Computers, and I can view Active Directory just like I can on NYC DC1. All right, there we go. And instead of only seeing one domain controller in the domain controllers OU, you guys can see that I now have two. I have NYC DC1 and I have NYC Server 1. Okay, So we officially have our domain controller set up on this other machine, and NYC Server 1 is now officially a domain controller. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.